Hello, and thank you for joining me today as we take a little look at some tips and guidance on to help you make you successful with your diploma in international financial reporting. My name is Jayne Howson. I am a chartered accountant and I have been helping students pass their exams for a number of years. Now, before we start, it's probably best to make really clear I'm not looking to go through past exam questions here. I'm also not looking to be able to reteach any particular topic. What I'm trying to do is to go through some points that we've picked up from looking at examiners' comments to try and make sure that students are more successful in the paper. So the basic introduction here is just to talk about what the examiners' comments have moaned about, is probably the best phrase here. The first thing is timing and reading the question. There have been comments made about students not being very good at keeping to time in the exam. In particular, there are 4 exam questions and many students fail because they simply attempt 1 or 2 of those and don't give themselves the best chance of passing. In addition, we need to think about how we read the question and pick up all the requirements. Linking into that, you will probably have found, if you've been going through some past exam questions, that the examiner quite likes the idea of communication. You are a senior person in an organisation, and we're trying to get you to think about explaining points to perhaps people who are a little bit more junior to you, rather than just crunching numbers. This has also been shown quite clearly in the ethics section of question 2 of the paper. There's always 5 marks available, which I shall point out to you in a little while, always 5 marks available, and students are throwing these marks away by not reading the question. So let's start first of all by thinking about some basic principles of timing and reading. Now, what you need to be aware of whenever you're looking at any question is, first of all, the number of requirements. Now, often that's quite straightforward because the examiner might have a heading saying requirements and number them 1, 2, 3, 4. That's fine. What I'm basically saying to you is sometimes in one sentence, there is more than one requirement. And if students are not reading it through thoroughly, they will miss crucial marks. The other thing to pick out when you're looking at the question itself and thinking about the timing is the mark allocation. Now, we know that the exam itself is 3 hours and 15 minutes long. Those 15 minutes are really there for you to be able to read through the paper, maybe select the order that you're going to do the questions in, and to give yourself a little bit of thinking time. And I would then recommend that we'd be looking at maybe 3 hours to be able to do the 4 questions available. That's 45 minutes each. And the way that I work that out is that 3 hours is 180 minutes. 180 minutes divided by 100 marks is 1.8 minutes a mark. So if you keep that in mind when you've got a 25 mark question, 25 times by 1.8 will give you the 45 minutes. Now, the reason that we always look at the mark allocation is because it not only gives us an indication of how long we're going to spend on something, it also gives us an indication of how much we need to write. Now, this might seem like quite basic points, and I'm just going to take a very simple example here for you. Now, I'm trying to try and combine both this idea of number of requirements and also the marks available. So let's say that the examiner said to you, calculate the amount to be recorded in the financial statements and explain the disclosures. Now, this could be about any particular transaction, but there's 5 marks. 5 marks, if you multiply that by 1.8, is going to give you 9 minutes. So 9 minutes to answer this. Now, I've not really been particularly specific about what the numbers would entail in here, but if you're not told anything otherwise, you need to allocate your time between the requirements. Notice this looks like one requirement when you first look at it, but actually this isn't one requirement, this is 2. And what you're always looking for in exam requirements is the word "and" in the middle of a sentence. So here we've got two things to do. We've got to calculate some numbers to go in the financial statements, and we've then got to explain the disclosures needed, all for 5 marks. And if it's not clear otherwise, always assume that those 5 marks are going to be split 50-50. 2.5, 2.5 would not be unreasonable. Now, it's not that the examiner's trying to trip you up in any way. All we're saying here is please make sure that you give yourself the best chance of passing by answering everything. If you read the requirement quickly and just see calculate the amount to be recorded, you would then miss all of those marks about explaining the disclosures. Now, the next thing that I want to get onto are the descriptive elements of questions. Now, you need to be very clear here. The examiner always says in question 1, and in question 1, this is normally where you're doing your preparation of some financial statements using a spreadsheet, the examiner will say, I don't want explanations. So in question 1, please do not give the examiner any explanations about what you're trying to do. By all means, give him workings when you're looking at the calculations themselves, but we do not need to see any words in there explaining in great detail what the accounting standard is behind your calculation. But what the examiner does like is descriptive elements in questions 2, question 3, and question 4. And usually in question 2, there will be a question that will give you some accounting transactions that you're asked your opinion on. And what we're looking for here is communication to explain to somebody how you're going to put those right. Now, there will also be a little element of ethics in question 2, and I'm going to come back to that in a while. Question 3 often centres on an accounting standard, and the examiner will ask you about the accounting standard and then give you the opportunity to apply your knowledge of it to some scenarios. So maybe you would then explain how transactions are accounted for. Question 4 is also largely descriptive, and this is no spreadsheets, no numbers required at all. It's where your examiner is testing knowledge about certain accounting standards again. Now remember, you are a fairly senior individual in your organisation. So what the examiner is looking for when they use descriptive elements is for you to communicate. Can you put in words what you're trying to achieve? Now, when they do this, one thing that I think you need to look out for in exam questions is the verb that they're using. Let me explain to you first of all. There are these 3 verbs that come up quite a lot when you're asked to try and consider a particular accounting transaction and think about how it needs to be accounted for. Usually, the word explain comes up. And what does the word explain mean? Well, explain basically means that you're trying to make something clear or intelligible, or you're stating the meaning or the purpose of something. Discussing is writing about a topic in detail, taking into account different ideas or different issues and weighing things up. Describing, on the other hand, is trying to communicate the key features of. So you might be asked to describe the elements or the information contained in an accounting standard. Now, these words or these verbs themselves are quite high skill. They're wanting you to try and have a conversation with somebody on paper rather than just providing a stream of numbers. And one of the big things that the examiner has often said in their examiner's comments is they really don't like the fact that you're asked to explain or to discuss or to describe, and all students do is give a series of journal entries. Imagine that. Let's imagine that you're in the office and somebody says to you, Could you just explain to me what we need to do here? And you say, well, why don't I just do some journals for you? Here we go. Here's some journals for you. Just go and put this in the computer system. We'll be absolutely fine. That's not what they've asked you to do. They want you to transfer information to them to allow them to do it. And that's what the examiner's trying to demonstrate a skill for here. Now, those verbs are different from the verb define. Now, your examiner has used the word define before now, and the word define basically means give me an exact meaning of. This is a knowledge dump type question where you're asked very clearly to just define a particular meaning. Now, all of these are ways of communicating. And if the examiner wants you to give him numbers rather than words, they're going to use the term calculate, compute, or prepare. Now, you look at the requirement in question number 1, and it asks you to prepare some financial statements. It's very clear that they do not want you to write about anything at all. Now, top tips if you're going to gain marks in written questions. As we've said, note the verb. That's really clear because it helps you understand how much detail you need to go into, and answer the question set. So if it says in the question, explain, what we want you to do is to take the situation that we've got at the moment and make it really clear to the reader that you understand what's going on. If the verb is to define, simply state the meaning of something. Now, other little things that we need to make sure you get right. Don't underline buzzwords. And what I mean by that is that what we don't want you to do is to start bolding or highlighting keywords. The examining team does not mark on buzzwords. They don't look for keywords when they're trying to mark. What they want to do is to see how you construct a sentence and that you can use these buzzwords in the correct surroundings. Now, the next 3 points really go together. Be specific. If the question asks you to comment on something about the company in the scenario, you make sure that you don't give general definitions or descriptions that are not relevant to that company. Write in short sentences. Make 1 point per sentence. Please don't use big flowery words. You're not looking at writing an essay. We need you to be really, really, really specific. Get to the point, make 1 point and move on. Now, finally, the other thing that I just wanted to mention down here is I think sometimes students feel that if they copy out the question, if they write out the question, that will help them in some way. No, it doesn't. You're wasting time. The examiner is going to give you no marks for writing out information they've already told you. So please don't write the question out or cut and paste it, as in some students do in exams. So let's have a look at a little example here. I'm not going to go through anything technical, as I've said before. I've given us an example on share-based payments. And really what I want to do is just to see how sometimes you might be asked to do some calculations, but then as we've got down here, to explain and show how equity share-based payments are reported in the financial statements. And I've given a name here of a particular company, Gamma. Now, 2 things that you need to make sure that you pick up on. Explain and show. Now, the word explain, we said before, was to make clear. We're trying to make it very clear how these equity share-based payments are going to be reported in the financial statements. Secondly, what we've got down here is a company. And this company will have, in the question, they will have given you some information about this company. So the question is not asking for you to regurgitate IFRS 2 and state everything you know about share-based payments. It's looking at the share-based payments for this company and making sure that those share-based payments are recorded in the financial statements. So I suggest that you pause for a minute, put your recording on pause, and just have a little think about what you think might need to come up in the financial statements. Okay, let's have a little think then, shall we? Now, obviously, when I'm looking at showing, somewhere I've probably done some calculations. But some thoughts for you. When you're explaining and you're talking about the financial statements, you know that we're looking at a statement of profit or loss or a statement of financial position. So what I really want to know down here is, where do these transactions go? Now, you may find that you've got, as you would do with an equity share-based payment, one side of the transaction will be recorded as an expense in the statement of profit or loss. So you say, this is an expense in the statement of profit or loss. And it be clear that it's an expense, not income. What you might also want to do is to talk about whereabouts in the statement of profit or loss it might go. Tell the examiner, I'm going to include this as part of the wages cost in the statement of profit or loss. And the other side of the double entry will be recorded as part of equity in the statement of financial position. Which accounting period? Tell the examiner very clearly from the information that you have about gamma in the statement of profit or loss or financial position for a particular year. Make it clear how much that transaction needs to be. This expense and this equity transaction will be this amount of dollars. And maybe, because we're also talking about explaining, describe any disclosures that might also need to be recorded in the financial statements. So don't just do the numbers. You need to explain to somebody where these numbers are going to go in the financial statements. In your head, look at financial statements, think P&L, statement of financial position, and then be very specific on where these transactions are recorded. Now, the other little bugbear, shall we say, of the examiner is looking at the ethics question. Ethics always comes up in question 2. And what the examining team are really trying to do here is to show not only that you can quote the ethical code, but you also need know how to apply it, and you understand what it means and the different scenarios that the ethical issues may arise. Now, as I mentioned to you before, there will be 5 marks out of the 25 marks specifically for ethical issues. And there'll be something in the question that makes you look at it and go, I don't think either myself, if I was being told what to do here, or the person who's giving me instructions is acting in an ethical manner. And what I want to talk to you about is how we go about answering questions. Now, some of the things that you need to get right. So here's a few little tips. Please don't just list the ethical code. If the examiner has asked you for explaining or discussing or describing, that is not just listing the ethical code. If he wanted you to list the ethical code, they'd tell you to state. You also need to know what the code means. And I don't just mean sort of generally, I mean each element of the code. And we're going to go through in a moment and we're going to have a look at what these different terms mean. It's important that you don't use terms that are similar to what we say in the code. You have to be very specific and use the specific terms. When you're reading through the question, always look for the threats. Now, different threats can be intimidation, self-interest, for example. And if you identify the threats that we have, that makes it easier for you to try and identify what the ethical issues are going to be. Use any information that you have in the scenario. So don't, again, as I mentioned before, we're not just looking at listing the ethical code here. We're trying to get you to think about how this is going to be used in a particular scenario. And this might seem really, really obvious to you, but please, please, please don't leave it out. Again, the examiner has said that in a number of occasions, there have been students who just don't answer the ethical element. Maybe it's a time issue. Maybe they've just not read the requirements properly and they just missed the whole point. This is 5 marks. It's really easy 5 marks as well, if you know what to look for. So let's have a look at the parts of the code. So what does integrity mean? Integrity means honesty. I don't want you to use the word honesty. I want you to use the word integrity. And integrity means that you are honest in everything that you do. Showing objectivity. Again, I don't want you to use other words like biased or not biased or neutral. I want you to use the word objectivity. And when somebody is being objective, it means that they're not biased. They are giving all sides of the information. So when you're presenting financial information, you're not highlighting the good bits and hiding the bad bits. You're showing everything on a reasonable basis. Showing professional competence and due care. This means keeping up to date with your accounting standards and making sure that you know how to apply any technical information at all to a particular scenario. Never do anything that is beyond your competency level. We're not all experts in everything when it comes to accountancy, but if you're holding yourself out to do a particular job, then you do need to show that you have the competence to do that. Professional behaviour. Professional behaviour means that you act in a way that does not discredit the ACCA. Now, telling lies, you could argue, not keeping up to date with your CPD and not knowing how to deal with something technically, all of those sorts of things could potentially be classed as not showing professional behaviour. And confidentiality, possibly the easiest one to spot in any scenario. You do not discuss matters that concern the company outside of the company. Anything that goes on at work stays at work. So let's have a look at how this could be used in a particular exam scenario. So first of all, let's have a look at an example. Let's take this example here. I've just sort of basically taken what you would typically get in a question 2. You've had a little chat with your FD and your finance director has told you that it's important for this year's financial results to show a higher profit than last year, and you won't get a bonus if they don't. Now, immediately you read that and you think about intimidation. That's quite intimidating. But also the other threat that's going on here is if you're not going to get a bonus, that means that there's some self-interest. It's in my best interest to make sure that these accounts are as good as they could possibly be. Now, both of those threats are going to tempt you to breach the ethical code. You're then told that we're applying for a bank loan too. So please make sure that you treat redeemable preference shares as equity to keep the debt from the statement of financial position. Now, we know that when we deal with redeemable preference shares, these are dealt with as debt instruments, which means that redeemable preference dividends are recorded as interest in the statement of profit or loss or finance costs, and in the statement of financial position, they're going to be recorded as liabilities. Now, there's a big temptation here, isn't there, that if we're looking to try and apply for a bank loan, we want to show that we've got no debt on the balance sheet already. So what the director's telling you to do here is breaching the ethical code because you know that that should not be recorded as an equity item. You know it should be recorded as debt, and you are breaching the code if you don't do that. So let's have a look at each of these. Integrity. I'm going to be tempted to maximize the profits and not be honest about the true position of the organization. I'm not going to be showing objectivity. Here you can see that there is some self-interest and intimidation, as we mentioned before, about the bonus. And that intimidation would lead us to potentially not be objective. We're going to be biased. We're going to be overstating profits potentially by inflating revenue and reducing costs. That's not showing objectivity. We're not showing professional competence and due care, because if we're going to start showing redeemable preference shares as equity instruments, that is not correct. And finally, this is not showing professional behaviour. Not submitting a bank loan that reflects the true position of the organisation and overstating profits shows lack of professional behaviour. If we're an ACCA accountant, what we're doing is discrediting the institute. Now, the only one I've not mentioned down here is confidentiality. Why? Because it's not applicable. Now, what would we need in this question for makers want to talk about confidentiality? Well, if we had a note in the question that said, you're a little bit unsure about this, so you've gone to talk to your friend to discuss what's going on, and maybe your friend can give you some advice. If your friend doesn't work for the organisation, that lacks confidentiality, and you mustn't do it. Now, remember I said to you that the examiner is looking for 5 marks in here. What they'll often do is ask you to comment on the key features. So what you're going to do is use the ethical language. You're going to pick the relevant sections from the ethical code. You're going to apply it to the scenario, as we've just done, perhaps mentioning any threats along the way. I hope you found that helpful. It's been lovely speaking with you. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish you the very best with your exams.